Likely you've heard the story of one night at sea. The captain of the ship looked into the dark night and he saw faint lights in the distance. Immediately the captain sent this message: "We are on a collision course. Advise you to change course 20 degrees. Promptly a return message was received: "Alter your course 20 degrees. The captain was angered. His command had been ignored, so he sent a second message: "Alter your course 20 degrees north. I am a captain." Again, another message was immediately received: "Alter your course 20 degrees north. I am a seaman, third class." Furious, the captain sent a third message: "Alter your course 20 degrees. I am a battleship." Then the reply came: "Alter your course 20 degrees. I am a lighthouse." Now, needless to say, the battleship changed course. Sailors have a saying: lighthouses never lie. A lighthouse is constant. It shines, pointing you to safe harbor. See, we can choose to be captain of our own souls and captain of our own story and captain of our own destiny, or we can make our way toward the light. We are in the book of Ephesians, and Paul, under the superintending of the Holy Spirit, wrote this letter to the church in Ephesus about some church matters that could potentially cripple the church in its effectiveness. Paul is writing this letter from prison. He was in prison because he could not help but speak of the gospel wherever he went. Now, it is possible that the place where Paul was living as a prisoner was on the top of a hill, and it would give him a great view of the city of Ephesus. Ephesus was a harbor city. It was a harbor city. And historians suggest that in Paul's day, and at the time of this letter, stood one of the wonders of the world at that time, at the lighthouse of Alexandria. It was roughly 400 feet tall, and it could be seen 100 miles away. At its apex was positioned a mirror which reflected sunlight during the day, and a fire was lit at night. And it was the job of the lighthouse keepers to make sure that the light did not go out. It was their job to keep the light on by keeping the fire stoked, keeping the fire going. Now, did Paul, as he looked out over the harbor city, writing this letter, see this lighthouse? Is it possible that as Paul speaks of living as children of light in the passage we're looking at this morning, Ephesians chapter 5, that lighthouse is in his view? Well, we don't know for sure, but a lighthouse is a wonderful picture for the church. The lighthouse is a symbol of deliverance. In the midst of stormy times, it is as we make our way toward that light, we find safety. Rescue is possible. You just have to look for the light. We ignore the light at our own peril. See, it's out of darkness into the light that really sums up the gospel. Now, we who have been rescued from darkness are now being transformed by the light and become the light, pointing others to safe harbor. And that's what the first 14 verses of Ephesians chapter 5 are all about. So if you aren't there already, I would invite you to turn your Bibles to Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5. We're not going to have time to go into detail all 14 verses, but I trust that you'll come away from this passage with a greater sense of the significance of light. Now, I want to briefly connect this section to what we looked at last week. And so look back with me at verse 32 of chapter 4. Now remember, there are no chapter breaks in the original writings. So we go back to chapter 4, verse 32, and it says, "Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you." And that really summed up the 8 verses of last week's message on where are we to go with our hurt. Now, it's very unusual for me to urge you, encourage you to look and listen to or watch online one of my messages. But from last week, I would really encourage you, if you weren't here, and if you didn't get a chance to check it out this past week, I'd invite you to do that, because it really is very significant for what we're doing in 2017, and something that can get in the way of our effectiveness as a church. So I'd really encourage you to look at that from last week, because if we don't address our hurt in a healthy way, it's going to harm our effectiveness as a church. Bottom line. The call last week was to enter the tunnel of your pain and bring it into the light. Well, let God put his light on any anger or any bitterness or any unwholesome words that have been hurtful, and replace it with what is said here in verse 32, kindness and compassion. As stated last week, as a church family and for our livelihood and effectiveness, we are going to need to say 3 words and say them frequently. I forgive you. I forgive you. Why? Because forgiven people forgive people. Just as Christ, in Christ, God forgave you, Jesus Christ is our pattern. Just as. Now hang on to that phrase. We're going to see it again the very next verse. Remember, no chapter breaks here. Chapter 5, verse 1, it continues. Be imitators of God, therefore, as dearly loved children, live a life of love, just as, there it is again, just as Christ loved us and gave himself for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. You see, there's a pattern for Christian living found in the person of Jesus Christ, who gave his life for us. He is the one by whom every believer is to trace his or her life. Or better put, we are to allow the Spirit of God to pattern us after the Son of God. His love is to be our love. His nature is now our nature, for we are called light in the Lord. Look at verse 8 of chapter 5. For you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of light. Believer, we have traded teams. We no longer are team darkness. We are now team light. It's critical then that we leave the light on for others to see our good deeds and glorify God in heaven. That's the basis of where we're going this morning. You see, as we went into those dark places of our soul last week, the stuff below the waterline, and looked at the relational sins and hurts, we must enter there again to those places not fitting for people of the light. Let's expose some areas of our lives this morning to his presence and ask this question: what is it in my life that needs to be eliminated? What is in my life that needs to be eliminated? No more playing games. I need to eliminate it. What is it that's going to dim or extinguish our light? Well, Paul speaks to those in verses 3 through 7. They're really tests of our purity. They fall under 2 headings, and I warned you last week this wasn't going to be an easy message. And you say, well, which one is? Well, I'll tell you when we get there. I just not sure we will. But there's 2 headings here, tests of our purity. Test number 1, dominating power of cravings that are not for God. Test number 1 of our purity, our dominating power of cravings that are not for God. Look with me, Ephesians chapter 5, verse 3. Verse 3, it says, but among you there must not be even a hint of sexual immorality or any kind of impurity or of greed, because these are improper for God's holy people. Now, there are three cravings that are mentioned here, the list here, and the first one is immorality. Immorality. Now, immorality can be a broad term for sexual sin, but I believe that the word porneia, and it seems to focus on the fulfillment of sexual desires before marriage. I say that because it's the same word that's used in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 2, that speaks of the temptation to immorality as a problem for those who are not married. I say that because in Matthew 15:19, Jesus gives a list of those things that come from the heart. And he lists several things. He says evil thoughts. He says murder. He says adultery. Then he adds another word, immorality. The NIV says sexual immorality. It is the word, translated other places, fornication, but it is the word porneia. Porneia. See, adultery is different from porneia, from fornication, from immorality in his list. Giving in to sexual cravings before marriage is clearly a contradiction of God's will, and it must be eliminated. Now, if you've already given in to that temptation, it isn't a reason to continue in it. And while you may not be able to give the precious gift of virginity to your future spouse, you can give your future mate the gift of a forgiven, redeemed, repented soul in union. And while it's critical that we flee from sexual immorality, it is equally critical that we know what to do after we sin. So to look at your spouse in the eye, or the one you're now with, and be able to say, you know, I failed you, and I failed God, but I turn away from that sin, and I receive His full forgiveness, and I'm going to choose to honor you and honor God from this day forward with my body. That is a wonderful gift to give to your spouse or your future spouse. Remember, you can end your relationship to sin at any point. To think you must continue in it because you've already blown it, it is a lie from the very pit of hell. Paul says, eliminate it from your life. Paul then mentions any kind of impurity. Now, the word impurity here refers to anything that is unclean and filthy. This would then include immoral thoughts and ungodly passions, ideas, and perversions of any kind. It covers a host of sexual sins like lust and pornography and websites and strip joints and movies that flash skin all over the place, adultery, sex before marriage, and could even include romance novels. Try that one. You see, our culture has so confused sexuality. You know, when you go to hotel rooms and you find that list of movies that have the title over it, mature audiences only? Really? Watching porn is mature? When I was in Portland, Maine, right there on my daily route to the church, I almost started going a different route so I didn't have to pass this place. But it was called Gentlemen's Club. It's a strip joint. That's where gentlemen go? To a strip joint? Really? That's being a gentleman? It's whacked out. It's whacked out. Follower of Christ, you were once darkness. Now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of light. A little boy constantly was falling out of bed. No matter what his parents did, the boy couldn't sleep without rolling out of his bed. Well, one day his uncle came to visit, and as usual, in the middle of the night, there was a thump followed by a cry. Parents kind of just blocked it out. They had this every single night. Well, the uncle heard it, and he ran into the boy's room. He saw him on the floor. Obviously, he fell out of bed, and he said, "What in the world are you doing? Why did you fall out of bed? Why?" And the little boy thought for a moment, and he said, "I don't know, but I think it's because I stayed too close to the place where I get in." That's a good answer. Are we staying too close to the place where we get in? Do we stay on the fringes of the darkness we once were? We keep falling. It's painful to even think about how the evangelical church has been rocked with repeated scandals in this one area of sensuality. It is gut-wrenching to consider the percentage of people, even in this room, who are being tripped up in this one area. Now, listen, this isn't about shaming any of you or making you feel any worse than you already do. That is not my point. On the contrary, it is giving you permission to bring it into the light and be honest with it. If there's any kind of impurity you're tolerating in your life, the word is eliminate it. Be radical if necessary. Immorality, impurity. He mentions a third word here, interesting in this context. It's the word greed. Greed. Now, generally speaking, greed's a strong, inordinate craving. It's the inability to be content and satisfied. And later on, even in this passage, it speaks of an immoral, impure, greedy person as an idolater. Interesting. Now, initially, when we see the word greed, we think of money or possessions or material things being at the center of focus. And it's true. It definitely applies to that, definitely means that, and that dominates your life. It needs to be addressed. But greed, I believe, that's spoken of here seems to go beyond the appetite for money or material things. In this context, the strong craving, I believe, the greed is for sex. It's greed that drives the pursuit of unclean behavior, which comes from what? A dissatisfaction. It goes like this. I am dissatisfied with the gift of sex in my marriage, so I seek it elsewhere. Or I'm dissatisfied with God's gift of sex, and by the way, he's pro-sex, just in case you're wondering. I'm dissatisfied with God's gift of sex to be in the covenant of marriage, so I'm going to pursue it outside of marriage. For all married or single, our most powerful craving ought to be for God. We're to be most satisfied in Him. That's why it's called idolatry, because He's being dethroned and our cravings being enthroned. And yet these sins seem so attractive and promising that spouses are abandoned, children are neglected, homes are destroyed, friends are disregarded, and the light of God no longer shines through the Christian community. How does this happen so frequently? Well, you know, there's a long answer to that, but let's stick to our passage and let's see the short answer. Did you catch the extent to which we are to go in not allowing these cravings to go berserk? What does verse 3 say? Go back to verse 3. But among you there must not be even a hint of sexual immorality or of any kind of impurity. A dating couple asks, well, I've been asked this, how far can I go? Not a hint of sexual immorality. Doesn't that just about cover it? Not a hint. In other words, draw a line and then stand 10 feet or so behind it. It's a much more effective strategy than to get as close to the line as possible and say, but I'm not going to go over it. Oh, yes, you are. What hints of sexual morality need to be eliminated? I think too many, for too long, are tolerating hints in their lives. Let me say that again. I think too many, for too long, are tolerating hints in their lives. Too many, for too long, are accepting a certain amount of impurity to enter in. A little boy's mother had just baked a fresh batch of cookies, and she placed those cookies in a cookie jar. She gave very clear instructions that no one was to touch those cookies until after dinner. Well, it wasn't long. She was in the other room, and she heard the lid of the jar move, and she called out, "Son, what are you doing?" To which a meek voice called back, my hand's in the cookie jar resisting temptation. Not a good strategy. All too often, when it comes to sexual temptation, many have their hands in the cookie jar, hoping somehow to not succumb to its goods. In this world, there are open cookie jars everywhere. And all around us, we see the pain and misery of those who have helped themselves. And when it comes to sexual temptation, we are not to resist, we are to flee. Run as far away as you can, and as someone said, don't leave a forwarding address. Be imitators of God, verse 1, not of the world. Let's keep our hands out of the cookie jar. This is one of the reasons for the decision to address this matter of purity for men over the next several months. And so, men, wherever you might be in this crucial matter of purity, I urge you to show up this Saturday to the breakfast and to continue meeting the first and third Saturdays for an hour and a half for a few months, no matter where you are in this. If you have victory in this, bring it to the table. We could hear from you. If you're somewhere on this continuum, somewhere else, show up. Test number 1 for purity: dominating power of cravings that are not for God. Second test number 2, is devaluing God's good gifts in our speech, in what we say. Devaluing God's good gifts in what we say. Paul shifts from sexual sins to verbal sins. And again, there are 3 items on this list. We're going to move through these rather quickly. Verse 4, he mentions obscenity. Nor should there be obscenity. Now, the world markets obscenity and keeps pushing the limits on what was once considered obscene is no longer viewed that way, right? Remember years ago, this is funny to me, remember years ago the controversy around the movie Gone with the Wind? Remember? It was all around the D word. Some of you here are going, there's a D word? I'm not giving it to you. You can ask mom and dad later. They can use it in a different sentence and you'll understand it. It's incredible how far we've come in our society, huh? And while we may not use obscenity, we laugh at it. Is there any filthiness that needs to go? For you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Filthy talk doesn't fit anymore the way we are. We have traded teams. We are on Team Light. So we talk of things of Team Light. During a long and losing baseball game, the restless 12-year-old boys were talking to Richie, their assistant coach, about his attractive younger sister. Well, annoyed at the idle chatter, the head coach hollered down to the guys, listen, guys, when you're in the dugout, talk baseball. After a moment's silence, a young voice began, so Richie, does your sister play baseball? They're going to get it in one way or another. That really leads to our next thing Paul mentions here, foolish talk. Foolish talk. What are the things we should be talking about on Team Light? Now, the word for foolish here, by the way, is where we get our word moron. And when I think of moronic talk, I think of the many of the talk show hosts on radio or television, I'll be honest with you. And we're not lacking in talk show hosts. People love foolish talk, and the entertainment industry is more than willing to oblige. And much of it is nothing more than superficial trivialization of God's creation and his good gifts. Comedians don't even know how to do a good joke, unless they put some filth in it. Now, don't get me wrong. It's okay to keep it light. It's good to laugh. If you know me at all, I love to laugh. I love to joke around. Life can be so hard sometimes. Yet coming under the light of God is this question of how much time do we spend talking about things that don't really matter? Are we flippant about the things that should be taken seriously? See, all of life is the work of a gracious and good God who has given us good gifts. As John Piper puts it, we don't have to trivialize the world in order to enjoy it. Flippant talk, filthy talk. Paul mentions one more matter of speech here, coarse joking. You see, what may start out as a little obscene moves quickly to foolish talk, and before long it degenerates to vulgar and crass talk and cheapening of sex and cheapening of women and cheapening of everything beautiful and private and displays it out in the open. Coarse joking describes sexual innuendos and crude talk. So there you have it. Verbal sins, sexual sins are not to be tolerated. So how do we get rid of those things from our lives? I believe it's found in verse 4. Let's read verse 4 again. Nor should there be obscenity, foolish talk, or coarse joking, which are out of place for God's people. Now get this, but rather thanksgiving. I'm not sure I would have said that was the remedy. Thanksgiving is the answer to that. Gratitude. The root of the sins mentioned here, and perhaps we could go as far as to say all sin, is thanklessness. I remember talking about that on the Sunday before Thanksgiving. It's a thankless heart that sets everything else in motion. Think about it in this context right here. Our sexual immorality and purity are driven by greed, and greed is a strong, discontented craving that takes over our lives. I mean, honestly, how much of your life is driven by cravings for what you don't have? The opposite experience is to be people of thanksgiving. Gratitude is when we believe that God is for us and not against us. Gratitude is when we believe that God only gives us what is good and He withholds no good thing. I mean, can we really overflow with thanksgiving to God and be dominated by some form of sexual sin at the same time? Can devaluing of God's gifts in our speech and thanksgiving to God coexist? Now, in the few minutes we have left, it's worth touching on our motivation a bit because it shows up in this section of Scripture. See, victory over these sins mentioned here and any other sin that so easily entangles us, it's found in our motivation. Paul doesn't shame us into changing our ways. He doesn't even quote any of the 10 commandments, though more than one would have been appropriate here. Why should I not participate in sexual and verbal sins? What is the motivation for eliminating these behaviors? It's the why behind the command. It's mentioned twice here in our passage. The end of verse 3 says, because, here's the motivation, these are improper for God's holy people. That's what we should be motivated by. It's said again in verse 4. Nor should there be obscenity, foolish talk, or coarse joking. Why? What's the motivation? He goes on, which are out of place. It's out of line, out of place, improper for a believer, a church, to carry on this way. These behaviors are not fitting for those who call themselves Christians. Don't imitate the world, imitate God. Verse 1. These behaviors need to go. Because when we imitate God, when we're motivated because we know it's out of place, others will see the light out of their darkness, and it's critical we leave the light on. Much of the scandal of our day has been in this very area, which has caused our light to flicker at best and go out at worst. Leave the light on. Let it shine on all areas of your life, driving away the darkness so that His light may shine through the prism of our lives. I ask you, is the light on? Is the light on? Or are we stumbling around in darkness? My previous ministry in Westerlo, the parsonage where we lived was right next door to the church. And while there were disadvantages to living that close to the church, as you can imagine, it was very convenient when I needed to run over to my office for something. Well, one particular Saturday night, One particular Saturday night, I entered the church building, and as you can imagine, it was pitch dark. And moving quickly, right, as type A personalities like me do, okay, we're always moving, figuring that I must have already gone from my house to the office 100 of times. There was no need for me to turn on the lights. Just whoop, run. Usually nothing stands in my way between the side door of the entryway of the church to my office door, which was in the same building. That's Monday through Friday. Saturday was different, as I was about to find out. There was a little table in the church foyer with a basket on it, and in the basket were the bulletins for the next day, for Sunday. I forgot that one minor change. And wouldn't you know it, in the blackness of the night, as I'm running at full speed, I ran into the table holding the basket of bulletins. Yeah, it hurt a little. But worse was that what I discovered when I turned the light on. Bulletins were spread all over the floor, and all those nice inserts were flying everywhere, all 200 of them. Now, I attempted to put everything back together, but I have a feeling that on that Sunday morning, some opened their bulletin to upside-down inserts or maybe flipped the other way. I don't know. I never asked. Now, I could have saved myself aggravation if I did what? Simply flipped the light switch on. I would then have seen what was in my way. Church, as we travel through this life, listen, we can spare ourselves all kinds of unnecessary pain and heartache if we simply flip the light switch on. We don't have to stumble around in the darkness. That is not what we are. Let God shine His light on the very thing that continues to trip you up. Why live that way? Why live in darkness? But everything exposed to the light, verse 13 says, becomes visible. Here's an obvious statement. For it is the light that makes everything visible. Well, we bring these 6 areas right here into the light. 2 tests of purity, dominating power of cravings that are not for God, and devaluing of good gifts by filthiness and flippancy. What were we? Darkness. What are we? Light in the Lord. Church, let's leave the light on. There was this lady who had a small house on the seashore of Ireland at the turn of the century, and she was quite wealthy, but was also quite frugal. The people were surprised then when she decided to be among the first to have electricity brought into her home. Well, several weeks after the installation of bringing electricity into her home, a meter reader appeared at her door, and he asked her if her electricity was working well, and she assured him, yeah, it's working great. Well, I'm wondering then if you could explain something to me, he said. Your meter shows scarcely any usage. I mean, are you using your power? Certainly, she answered. Each evening when the sun sets, I turn on my lights just long enough to light my candles, and then I turn my lights off. She tapped into the power, but did not use it. Her house is connected, but not altered. Are we connected, but not altered? Trusting Christ for salvation, but resisting transformation? Are we flipping the switch and then settling for shadows? The call then, as it says in verse 14, wake up, O sleeper, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. Loved ones, you don't need to sleepwalk through your Christian life. Don't give the appearance you're awake, yet you're asleep. Don't have a form of godliness without its power. Like light keepers of the lighthouse, it's our responsibility to keep the light on. Let's leave the light on, not only for our sake, but to point others to safe harbor. You know, there's no greater thing than to watch people move from darkness